Talk about a number of issues. We have with us Amanda Hughes. She'll be talking about art and community. We have John Borden from Texas A&M talking about holistic and community garden. Paul, who will be talking about poetry and science. And myself, Stephen Sargent, we're going to be talking about issues of race. So let's just get it started, and I'm interested in hearing Chris's views on poetry and science and how those things intermix.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, I got into slam poetry back in 2007. I was a master's student at Texas A&M University getting my mechanical engineering degree on electrospinning polymer nanofibers for biomedical applications. Now, as I was in the throes of writing my thesis, I would go to Revolutions and hear the poetry. And what I ended up finding out was, while I wrote poetry, it helped me write my thesis. Because either way, I was always writing. And because I was constantly writing, I was constantly exploring ideas and ways to communicate ideas that I felt made my thesis better. And it brought me to an interesting idea that we could possibly use poetry to explain scientific concepts. I came to this conclusion from one of two different areas. From hearing about slam poetry, I found out that a lot of slam poets are essentially storytellers. They tell a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the end of their story, they normally have a point or conclusion they get to that they want their audience to see. That's no different from scientists. When scientists give an idea, they also have a beginning, middle, and end. We just call it the scientific method, which has a question, a hypothesis, a procedure, a testing, analysis, and then a conclusion. If you group the two together, that's your first two is your beginning, the middle two will be your middle, and the last will be your end. I've noticed that scientists are not really good storytellers. They speak a language that not many people get except for other fellow scientists, which makes it hard for people to see scientists as storytellers. So putting poetry and science together would be kind of a win-win situation, because poets can then explain ideas that are very complex to the audience, and then science can grow because everyone's basic knowledge of science will grow from that. Yes?
I just wanted to comment on what Chris said about poetry and science and how a lot of scientists are bad storytellers, and that made me think about an opposite thing that I kind of seen in poetry, and that is a lot of poets aren't scientific. Some of them are, but a lot of times poets will get up and they'll do poems, they'll do a political poem, and it'll sound really nice, but it's not necessarily accurate. And my father, I grew up, when I was little, my father and mother lived in a duplex with my uncle and aunt. And my father and uncle were both in graduate school, and so I've kind of always been exposed to the scientific method. So when I do a poem that's not like about a personal poem, but about history or politics, I always start out with about a week of research. It sounds silly, but like I start off and I research, I make sure all my facts are right, and then after I get all the facts right, then I start doing the whole poetry thing. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, what you said.
Well, to take it on from that, what's interesting about it is that when most people do slam poems, when you hear a slam poem, they're very social, personal, or politically charged. A lot of them are about race, about social issues of our time. The gay issue was one of the big ones at the last Poetry Slam, the national one, and also from their own personal experiences that they overcame. So a lot of the poets take their personal experiences, but they reintroduce it in a clever way with a new metaphor. So this is where the challenge is for poetry and science to come together, because you really have to know your audience, because you're not taking a simple You're not taking something that's simple and universally known, like hope or a dream, and introducing it in a new way. You have to take something that's not known and relate it to something that people do know, which causes poets to really know who they're talking to. Because if the audience doesn't know what your metaphor is, they're not going to know what you're talking about. And that is truly one of the hardest concepts to overcome to make this poetry and science come together. Because most of the science that we do is all based on discovery and repetition of the discovery.
All right, so Chris has been talking about how poetry or art can mesh in with science and teach people science. I'm interested to hear what Amanda thinks about art, poetry, music, how these things can have an impact on community. And when you say community, what do you describe as community?
Community is a family. Most definitely. Community is our family. Wow. And the thing I like about art, and the thing that really makes me an artist, and the thing I love about art is that in every dictionary, the definition of art is completely different, each and every one. And I guarantee you ask somebody what their definition of art is going to be different from the other person. And I think that art, in my mind, is communication. As an artist, I paint something or sculpt something because I'm feeling it or I'm trying to communicate who I am to the public without verbalizing it. And I think that is extremely important. And it's happening. I mean, there's nothing you can really do about it because there's advertisements. That's art. It's communication. They may be completely selling out and all that kind of stuff, but it is communication. Graffiti, that is the most literal form of art in the community. It is physically in the community. And there are several different kinds of graffiti. There is gay graffiti, mapping out, what their turf is, and then there is communicational graffiti. You communicate. They have a point that they want to make, and they want to voice themselves without being seen because it's illegal. And I think it's beautiful. And I think without communication, community, they can't live without each other. They thrive on each other.
So we've talked about science and poetry, we've talked about art. Where does holistic gardening come into this?
Well, in the context of community, one thing I've noticed is that these community gardens that are kind of popping up all across the nation, or community gardens that are, been somehow, there for, 30, 40 years, and have now being revived, restored, revitalized, and refreshed with a new dose of community care and interaction. I've noticed that they've become sort of the 21st century version of the commons. I think a lot of people kind of see parks and local lakes, local rivers, etc. as kind of more version of the commons, and that they're commonly owned. But the thing about these community gardens is that historically commons were not merely just owned by the surrounding community, but also they were used by the surrounding community, not merely for productive purposes, but also for interactive purposes. And what I'm saying with these community gardens is that they become quite the focal point for local neighborhoods to come to gather to not only use for productive capacity, but to interact. And some of these interactions that I've had with people from local Neal Park Community Garden have been very interesting, very fulfilling. I've gotten some wonderful stories off of them, and it's really something else.
It's interesting how